Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into the secretive, seductive world of Japanese courtesans women, who were far more than just entertainers. They were artists, elite companions, masters of intrigue, and sometimes survivors of unimaginable pressures. But one subject that is rarely discussed is what happened when these high-ranking courtesans became pregnant. From secret abortions to bizarre herbal remedies and even chilling rituals whispered about behind closed doors, their methods were often as shocking as they were heartbreaking. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine being dressed in 12 layers of silk, so tight you can barely breathe. Your hair styled with enough pins to conduct lightning, and your feet forced into wooden shoes, so high that one wrong step could land you in the next life. Welcome to the daily grind of an Edo period courtesan. Yoshiwara, the most famous red light district of old Tokyo, was not just a neighborhood. It was a stage, a fantasy world wrapped in incense smoke, lantern glow, and heavy denial. To the outside world, courtesans were living art. They danced, they played shamisen, they recited poetry, but above all, they mastered the one talent society valued most, pretending everything was fine. Spoiler alert, it was not. Behind the fans and flirtation, the courtesan's life was less Cinderella and more luxury hostage. These women were bought young, often sold by their families for a sack of rice and the vague promise of opportunity. They were trained like opera singers and gladiators combined. Make no mistake, they were elite, but they were also owned. Every step they took, every client they smiled at, every coin they earned belonged to someone else, usually a brothel owner or oya, which is Japanese for overlord. With good lighting, courtesans were products investments in pregnancies, were considered the ultimate product defect, because if there is one thing worse than losing money in business, it is having your best performing merchandise go out of service for 9 months. Now, in a perfect world, a courtesan might have taken time off for a baby shower, a sabbatical, maybe a quiet retreat with prenatal yoga and hot stone therapy. But this was not a perfect world. This was Yoshiwara, where the only stones were the ones you might be stoned with if you broke contract. Pregnancy did not just mean losing work. It meant scandal, it meant punishment, it meant quite literally blood in the bathwater. So while the streets outside echoed with the clip-clop of platform shoes and sweet laughter, the inner chambers held darker truths, secrets whispered behind screens, remedies passed down not from healers, but from survivors. This was a world of velvet and iron, soft to the eye, brutal underneath. For the courtesans living inside it, getting pregnant was not just a problem. It was a crisis. Wearing lipstick, if you have ever signed a contract without reading the fine print, congratulations, you have already shared something in common with an Edo-era courtesan. Except in her case, the fine print included phrases like, "You will never own your life again," and "Oh, and by the way, do not get pregnant unless you enjoy pain, shame, and herbal poison." Courtesans did not enter the industry with resumes and references. Most were sold into it as girls, sometimes as young as 7, by families who needed money or just did not want another mouth to feed. It was the 1600s. Netflix was not around, so people entertained themselves by selling their daughters and blaming karma. Once inside the brothel, everything came with a price tag. The kimono she wore, debt. The hair oil, debt. The lessons in poetry, tea ceremony, and how to pretend you are thrilled by middle-aged men discussing rice taxes, debt. By the time she was ready for clients, she already owed more money than a failed startup. Now the contract, and let us use that term lightly, because she had no legal say in it, was basically a glorified leash. It dictated when she slept, who she served, how she smiled, and most importantly, that her uterus remained strictly decorative. Pregnancy was not in the brochure. And let us not forget the clients. A diverse collection of drunk samurai, emotionally starved merchants, and the occasional poet who thought whispering about cherry blossoms counted as foreplay. These men were not looking for long-term commitment. Most were not even looking for eye contact. And if they got a courtesan pregnant, they disappeared faster than your paycheck after payday. Of course, the brothel did not blame the man. That would be far too progressive. Instead, the woman, the walking investment, was accused of carelessness as if she had simply tripped and fallen into an accidental third trimester. In some establishments, even the suspicion of pregnancy was enough to get a courtesan reassigned to the bottom rung. The clients with fewer teeth and more complaints or worse, she would be locked away until the problem resolved itself. You see, this was not just about sex. It was about control, reputation, and money. And babies were bad for business, because nothing ruins a romantic illusion faster than morning sickness. So what happens when a courtesan in Yoshiwara does the one thing she is absolutely not supposed to do? No, not fall in love that is frowned upon but survivable. We are talking about the big one. The moment her stomach starts growing for reasons other than bloat from too much fish soup. Pregnancy, the ultimate plot twist. See, in this elegant silk-wrapped prison, getting pregnant was not a beautiful miracle. It was a career-ending biological betrayal. In modern terms, it was like your iPhone suddenly deciding it wanted to be a toaster beautiful, maybe useful, but not anymore. The courtesan's role was to entertain, seduce, and maintain the illusion that every client, no matter how hairy, drunk, or emotionally unstable, was her one true love. A baby that shattered the fantasy suddenly made clients remember that actions have consequences. No one is paying premium rates to be reminded they left their real family across town. To the brothel, pregnancy was not a matter of health. It was a product of malfunction. A courtesan's value depended on her availability. If she is busy gestating a small human, she is not serving tea, singing songs, or flirting with men old enough to be her grandfather. That means she is not making money, which means the brothel is not making money, which means someone is going to be very, very angry. There are no sympathy cards, no congratulations on the new arrival banners, just a lot of whispering behind fans, and the looming threat of being demoted from living artwork to unmarketable liability. At best, she might be hidden away until the issue resolves itself, which, let us be honest, is a poetic way of saying, handle it or else. At worst, she would be thrown out penniless with a reputation so tarnished even the low-tier tea houses would not touch her and the baby. Let us just say this was not exactly a culture built on maternity leave. Pregnancy in the courtesan world was not just forbidden. It was feared, because once it happened, everything changed. The Oya, who was once the glittering centerpiece of the district, became an unspoken warning to the others, a reminder cloaked in silence, and shame that bringing life into the world might very well end your own. You would think in a place like Yoshiwara, where secrets flowed more freely than sake, that a little thing like pregnancy might be handled with quiet sympathy and delicate discretion. Yeah, no. The moment a courtesan suspected she was pregnant, a ticking clock started in her head, not toward motherhood, but toward ruin. And make no mistake, she was on her own. There were no best friends rushing over with comforting words in pickles. There were no spa days or maternity massages. There were just paper walls, fake smiles, and a whole lot of lying. Everything became a covert operation. Morning sickness blamed on bad shellfish, fatigue, just a little tired from dancing all night, missed cycle. Oh, you sweet summer child, do not ever say that out loud. Beneath the surface-level glamour of painted faces and elegant kimonos was a parallel world of whispers, hushed rituals, and quiet panic. Courtesans shared remedies in code, passed down like haunted family recipes. Try the tea with 3 leaves, not 5. 5's for headaches, 3's for, well, you know. Even the act of checking if you were pregnant had to be done in secret. Some girls became experts at reading their bodies, like they were decoding enemy messages. A missed period could mean anything, right? Stress, diet, and so forth. Mercury being in retrograde, or as it was known in the Edo period, meant that another god had been angered once again. If you were certain, that was when the real performance began. You still had to work, still had to flirt, still had to endure being poured at by clients who definitely caused this in the first place without them ever suspecting a thing. It was emotional espionage in high heels. Some courtesans even altered the way they walked to hide changes in their bodies. They would tighten their obi belts just a little more, risking fainting rather than showing the slightest bump. Vanity was not the motive, survival was. And of course, all of this had to be done while still being enchanting, because heaven forbid your emotional distress interrupt someone's evening of purchased romance. Beneath the layers of silk and powdered faces were women quietly waging war against their own biology and against a world that demanded perfection but offered no grace. And it all had to stay hidden, because once the secret got out, the kimono was not the only thing that could come undone. Let us talk tea, not the kind you sip while gossiping about your neighbor's suspicious new kimono. No, this tea had a very different purpose, one that came with cramping, bleeding, and the faint possibility of death. Welcome to the courtesan's secret weapon, herbal abortion brew. Because when you could not exactly stroll into a pharmacy and ask for one discreet termination, please, you turned to Mother Nature and hoped she was in a merciful mood. The most infamous players in this deadly tea party were mugwort, safflower, and kanzo, otherwise known as licorice root. That sounds innocent until you realize it was taken in horrifying doses that could make your uterus flip a table. These were not your garden variety sleepy time teas. These were brewed like potions from a grim fairy tale steeped, long taken hot, and chugged down in desperate gulps while praying to every god and ancestor you could remember. Did it work? Sometimes. Did it also destroy your insides, induce hallucinations, or give you a fever that felt like a preview of the afterlife? Also, yes. The recipes varied. Some were passed between courtesans like coded scrolls. Add ginger if you wanted to act faster. One might say, do not use too much safflower or your skin will start to burn. Another might whisper that it was part science, part superstition, and entirely unregulated disaster. The worst part was you had to keep working the whole time. Imagine entertaining clients, smiling sweetly, making small talk about moonlight and cherry blossoms, all while bleeding internally and hoping this was the cup that did the trick. And if the tea did not work well, that just meant it was time to move on to the next method, because in this game, there were no do-overs, just a terrifying ladder of solutions, each one darker than the last. For some, the herbal tea was enough. For others, it was just the opening act in a play titled, Please Do Not Let the Brothel Find Out. But the truth was clear. In the pleasure quarters, even something as innocent as tea could become a lethal gamble. And when your life is held together by silk, smiles, and secrets, one wrong sip could unravel everything. If the tea did not work, and let us be honest, herbal roulette was not exactly foolproof, there was always another option. More hands-on. Enter the midwives. Not the sweet, smiling birth attendants you might imagine from folktales. No, these were women of shadows, ghosts in the alleyways of Yoshiwara, legends passed between trembling lips. No signage, no appointments, no receipts, just pain, blood, and a whole lot of praying. They were called bazin, literally old women, and many of them had once been courtesans themselves, retired not by choice, but by the harsh reality of time. And with no savings, no pensions, and no market for gray-haired flirtation, they became specialists in fixing problems, unofficial ones. You did not find them. You heard about them. A whispered name. A folded note tucked in a sleeve. You knocked on the right door at the wrong time of night, and hoped you brought enough coin and enough courage. The tools were usually a mix of crude implements, boiling water, cloth rags, and whatever was lying around. Surgical steel and sanitation were concepts for another century. No anesthesia, no aftercare, just grit your teeth and hope the gods are too busy to notice. And yet, to desperate courtesans, these midwives were saviors grim, sharp-fingered saviors who did not ask questions and did not tell lies. Payment was not always money. Some took hairpins, trinkets, or silk sashes. One story tells of a midwife who accepted a rare perfume bottle in exchange for silence and then wore it daily like a war medal. The risk was enormous: infection, hemorrhaging, permanent infertility, or worse. Many girls never returned to the brothel. The official explanation: she caught a fever. The unofficial one: she caught reality with both hands and did not survive it. If something went wrong, there was no legal recourse. After all, what could you tell the authorities? "Hello, officer. I illegally sought an abortion while working in a government-regulated sex district. Could you please arrest me?" Lastly, these midwives were the final stop before ruin or exile. No training, no ceremony, just candlelight, trembling hands, and the hope that today death was not charging full price. And somehow, even in this world of blood and fear, trust was forged between the broken and the ones who helped them break in silence. In most cultures, a hot bath is a symbol of peace and relaxation, a little self-care after a long day of pretending to like your job. But in the world of Edo period courtesans, a hot bath could mean something far more sinister and far more permanent. Welcome to the boiling bath method, a home remedy that promised to take care of the problem by turning your womb into a sauna from hell. The idea was simple: soak in a bath so hot your body would forcibly reject the pregnancy. Think of it as a spa day designed by a sadistic herbalist with a grudge against reproductive health. The method was whispered about in hushed tones behind paper screens. "Stay in until you feel dizzy," they would say. "If you faint, it is working." Medical advice at its finest. Some girls added special herbs to the water mugwort again, of course, because apparently that plant was the Swiss Army knife of uterine sabotage. Others drank sake beforehand, because why not combine internal poisoning with external overheating? It was dangerous, extremely dangerous. You were not just risking the pregnancy, you were risking your own life-scalding burns, shock, heat stroke. There are accounts of women fainting mid-bath and being dragged out unconscious, only to die quietly in some hidden room while the brothel continued its evening business. Nothing ruins a client's mood like stepping over a corpse on the way to his sack tray. And yet, the method persisted because it was fast, cheap, and relatively discreet. No tools, no midwife, just water, willpower, and a very high pain tolerance. The courtesans were told to breathe through the pain, to stay calm, to keep quiet even while their bodies boiled from the inside out all, so the brothel would not lose its best moneymaker. Because nothing screams customer service like telling a girl to self-harm quietly in the back room. If the bath worked, the pregnancy ended. If it did not, well, there were always darker options. In a world where a baby could cost you your status, your contract, or your life, a near-fatal bath was not extreme. It was just another Tuesday. When herbal teas failed and boiling baths did not quite do the trick, courtesans turned to another time-honored technique in the ancient art of pretending everything is fine: tight binding. The idea: if you wrap your abdomen tightly enough, maybe, just maybe, you can squeeze the baby out of existence, or at the very least hide it long enough to avoid a scandal and a demotion to the drunk uncles and smelly merchants' clientele tier. Enter stomach binding, known as haramaki. It was basically a DI womb corset. Long strips of cloth were wrapped again and again around the lower torso until the courtesan resembled a very glamorous sushi roll one, holding in something she desperately did not want to deliver. Of course, there were problems. Minor things like breathing and digestion, and that pesky little issue of internal organ compression. But in the pleasure districts, comfort was always optional. Image was everything. Some courtesans bound themselves so tightly they could barely sit down, let alone dance, pour tea, or carry on a conversation about the beauty of the cherry blossoms. But they did it anyway, because a visible pregnancy was social suicide. And in Yoshiwara, appearances were not just maintained, they were enforced. The courtesans became experts at posture control. Standing up straight was not about elegance. It was about keeping pressure on the womb. Slouching meant loosening the bind. Loosening the bind meant discovery, and discovery meant doom. Some even slept with the binding still on, as if constricting their midsection 24/7 would convince the fetus to rethink its life choices and quietly back out. It did not, of course, and binding did not stop the pregnancy. At best, it delayed the reveal. At worst, it caused complications, ruptured tissues, dizziness, fainting, internal bleeding. But none of that mattered when the alternative was losing everything. You had bled and smiled and danced to build. It was not about comfort. It was not even about safety. It was about survival and illusion. Because in the world of Japanese courtesans, the belly must remain flat, the smile serene, and the truth tightly wrapped beneath layers of silk and shame, even if what you are really hiding is heartbreak. At some point, you have to admire the creativity, because when teas, baths, and body wrapping failed to correct the issue, courtesans sometimes turned to the most comforting thing available in any crisis food. And not just any food. Rice balls soaked in sake. Yes, fermented rice wrapped lovingly in cloth and consumed in hopes that it might dissolve an unwanted pregnancy like yesterday's gossip. The logic was dubious. The desperation very real. Folklore whispered that vinegar, sake, and certain fermented foods had weakening effects on the womb. Courtesans were told by each other, by old servants, by the midwives with half an herb shop in their apron, that if you ate just the right combination of ingredients, you could wash the seed away. It sounds like a tragic fairy tale, and in many ways it was. The recipe varied by district. In one brothel, the go-to method involved warm sake mixed with crushed garlic and pickled plum, which probably tasted like despair with a hint of nausea. Another popular combo was rice balls marinated in vinegar, ginger, and shame, served cold, very cold. Did it work? You know the answer. Not really, unless you count vomiting and intestinal distress as results. But in a world where your entire future hinged on hiding your condition, even a placebo with side effects was worth trying. Some courtesans were told to chant little verses while eating part spiritual ritual, part emotional coping mechanism something, along the lines of, "Return to the river, little child, for now is not your time." And then they would swallow, trying not to gag. There is something incredibly human and heartbreakingly naive in this method, kind of hopeful magic passed between trembling hands. Because unlike the midwife or the boiling bath, this one felt gentler, almost like a ritual, almost like a prayer. But no amount of sake could rewrite biology. And while the rice balls offered comfort, they rarely offered results. Still, courtesans kept trying, because when your body is not your own, and your choices are limited to pain or secrecy, sometimes the only power you have left is believing in something, even if that something is a soggy rice ball soaked in old liquor and whispered regret. So let us say a courtesan gets pregnant. She is terrified, bleeding from herbal teas, possibly half poached from a boiling bath, and she has tried every rice ball in the folklore cookbook. Naturally, the next logical step might be to tell the father, "Ah, sweet child, that man is already gone." Courtesans do not operate in a world where paternity is a shared responsibility. They operate in a fantasy one the client paid for. And the minute that fantasy tries to become reality, the man vanishes like a samurai in a scandal. Most clients were married. Others were officials, nobles, or merchants, with reputations they absolutely did not want associated with illegitimate children from the pleasure quarters. So when that courtesan nervously hinted there might be consequences, the reaction was almost universal. "Sorry, I am moving to Osaka permanently. Also, I do not know you." Courtesans were trained not to expect loyalty. That is why any emotional attachment was considered dangerous. But still, many women held on to a fragile hope that the man they saw week after week, who brought gifts and shared secrets, might do the right thing. He did not. Even in rare cases where a client wanted to help, there were layers of legal and social barriers that made acknowledgement nearly impossible. Claiming the child meant scandal. Scandal meant consequences. And for most Edo men, consequences were the one thing more terrifying than commitment. Some tried to leave money quietly. A few gold coins slipped to a brothel servant with instructions to take care of it. Others pretended they did not recognize the woman at all. You have to understand, the courtesan was a fantasy, and fantasy does not get pregnant. So when reality knocked in the form of morning sickness, swelling feet, or a missed cycle, the men did what men have done in many chapters of history. They got really, really good at ghosting. The father's silence was not just literal. It was cultural, institutional, practically a tradition. No messages, no visits, no names on scrolls, just another shadow in a world already thick with them. And for the courtesan, there was no time to grieve or rage. There was only the next performance, the next lie, and the silence growing in her womb. If pregnancy was a personal disaster, then letting the brothel find out was the apocalypse complete with dramatic consequences. Zero sympathy, and absolutely no baby shower. You see, the brothel was not just your workplace. It was your world, your landlord, your agent, your stylist, your parole officer, all rolled into one. And like most institutions that care deeply about profits, and very little about people, it had one golden rule: do not get pregnant. So what happened when a courtesan slipped up? Well, it was not handled with sensitivity or a calm sit down with the boss. No, we are here to support you vibes. Just a lot of side-eye, passive-aggressive fan snapping, and the looming sense that you were about to be thrown under the gilded bus. The moment the suspicion arose, maybe you were walking a little slower, eating a little less, or just existing too carefully, the whispers began. First came the rumors. She is getting fat. She looks pale. She skipped her cycle. I heard it from the maid who empties the chamber pots. Then came the surveillance. Suddenly, you were not allowed to leave the room alone. Your friends were asked to report on your activities. You were given less work, not out of compassion, but because they were prepping your replacement. And finally, if they were sure, punishment. Now, this varied depending on the brothel's mood, status, and general appetite for cruelty that day. Some demoted the courtesan to the lowest ranks, forcing her to serve the roughest, drunkest, least hygienic clients imaginable. Others confined her to her room until she dealt with the issue. Some simply kicked her out. No money, no support, just a silk bundle of shame and a warning to others. In more elite houses, there was the illusion of discretion. They claimed she was on retreat or visiting family, but everyone knew what that meant. Pregnancy was not just a personal failing. It was a business risk, a contamination of the illusion. And in a system built entirely on fantasy, reality was considered rude. So when the brothel found out, there were no tears, no hugs, just cold calculations and the slow, quiet eraser of a woman who broke the one rule everyone pretended was not already broken. When you have tried every tea choked down the vinegar rice balls nearly boiled yourself, like an overcooked dumpling, and the brothel starts to look at you like a faulty lantern, you have got two options: confess and face the consequences, or run like hell. And some courtesans chose exactly that. They disappeared in the districts. They were branded ninja Jaruro runaway prostitutes, a term that translates roughly to "she messed up the fantasy. Now go fetch her back." because running away was not just frowned upon, it was illegal. You were property, and when property walks out the door with a baby on board, the brothel takes it personally. But that did not stop them. Some courtesans fled in the dead of night, disguised in plain robes with their hair undone, abandoning their ornate identities the way a snake sheds its skin. They slipped through alleyways, rode carts meant for laundry, or hid inside barrels. Yes, really, barrels. It was dramatic, dangerous, and desperately cinematic. Where did they go? Anywhere that did not require perfume. The courtesans pretended to have relatives with farms in the mountains, or a shrine far away, or a quiet fishing village places where no one asked questions unless you stole their sake. These were places where the name Yoshiwara didn't open doors, it closed them. And eventually, the lie she was carrying became too big to hide beneath the silk. There was no fanfare, no naming ceremony, just a bundle of blood and breath, wrapped in a cloth and hidden before dawn. If she was very fortunate, a servant girl or an old retired courtesan might help. These were women who de-seen it all and kept their mouths shut tighter than a lacquered box. Other times, they were passed to orphanages or into servitude, or simply vanished into the folds of forgotten stories. Echoes of regret carved into the wind like invisible gravestones. It wasn't just a shrine. It was an altar to every dream that never stood a chance. And the worst part? And the courtesans who had no freedom in life sought freedom for their unborn in death. It was the only parental act they were allowed, and it was heartbreaking. Even in the darkest corners of silk and shadow in Yoshiwara, the pleasure district was always loud. Laughter echoed down lantern-lit alleys. Music floated through the sliding doors. Perfumed clients shouted about love they didn't mean. Courtesans giggled, poured sake, and told 100 lies an hour all for the price of illusion. But beneath all that noise, something remained perfectly still. Silence, a specific, deliberate kind, the kind that wrapped itself around certain topics like a velvet chokehold. And at the center of that silence was the unwritten rule. Imagine lighting incense for the child you never got to name, whispering, "I'm sorry." Not because you didn't love them, but because you did in a world that didn't give you room to show it. Some came back again and again, year after year, unable to forget. Others visited once and never returned, too afraid to reopen the wound. But all of them carried it, because even in a world built on forgetting, some memories refused to drown. That's where the Mizuko Kayo came in a secret ritual, a whispered apology, a kind of emotional exorcism dressed in prayer beads and incense. The ceremony was small, sometimes held at a quiet temple outside the district, sometimes performed in private late at night, with only a flickering lantern and trembling hands. Offerings were left, baby toys, flowers, little red bibs tied around Jizo statues, the Buddhist guardian of children and travelers. No one ever asked who left the child, because in the floating world of courtesans, everyone already knew, they just pretended not to. The courtesan didn't leave her child because she didn't care. And in the world of the courtesan, these spirits were everywhere. They were called Mizuko, literally water children, a poetic name for something profoundly heavy, the souls of children who were never born or who were born and never raised. No matter how silent the birth, how quiet the abandonment, these spirits didn't simply disappear. They lingered. Mizuko were believed to float between worlds, not fully in the realm of the living, yet not quite passed on either. In many ways, they mirrored the women who carried them. Courtesans, after all, also existed between realities, glamorous but enslaved, adored but discarded, present but unseen. And so a strange kinship formed one ghost carrying another. She left it because there was no other path. The brothel wouldn't allow children. The law offered no protection. And even if she ran, what future could she offer a baby while hiding from bounty hunters with nothing but a comb and a blood-stained obi? So she did the unthinkable not out of cruelty, but out of love, twisted by desperation. They brought towels, boiled water, whispered prayers, and never asked what would happen to the baby afterward. And the baby? Well, that was the question no one wanted to answer. Some were taken away immediately. Others stayed hidden for a few days, tucked in a corner, fed in silence, loved with trembling hands. But everyone knew this was temporary. The child didn't belong here. There was no room in the pleasure quarters for innocence. There was only one thing left to do: give birth quietly, invisibly, preferably without anyone noticing. They gave birth like ghosts, then wiped their faces, fixed their hair, and returned to the brothel floor as if nothing had happened. No maternity leave, no postnatal care, just another performance. Because in Yoshuara, the show must go on. Welcome to the underground world of silent deliveries, where motherhood arrived in the dead of night behind sliding paper doors with towels stuffed in mouths to muffle screams. And in the pleasure districts, babies weren't blessings. They were liabilities, with lungs loud, hungry, and impossible to explain to your next client. So what did she do? She walked under cover of night to the edge of town, to the roadside, to a place built for tragedy, a shrine of abandonment, known as Koya or Yubusut sites. These were quiet stone shrines tucked into the corners of society, halfway between a place of worship and a dumping ground. They weren't publicized, but everyone knew they existed, and everyone knew what they were for. A mother, often a courtesan, a servant, or any woman society had failed, would leave her infant on the steps, swaddled tightly, sometimes with a name, sometimes with nothing but a small charm or folded prayer tucked into the cloth, and then she walked away. No goodbye, no witness, no turning back, no birthing chairs, no midwives in cheerful aprons, no cries of joy, just urgency, terror. And if you were lucky, someone who knew how to boil water without asking questions. Sometimes it happened in secret rooms, ones the brothel conveniently didn't know about. Other times it happened in storage closets, behind drapes, or even outdoors under cover of darkness. Because nothing says beautiful miracle of life like squatting behind a bathhouse with a handkerchief in your teeth. Not everyone made it. Some were caught, dragged back, and punished publicly, both as a warning and a morale booster for the rest of the staff. Look what happens when you act like you have free will. Others disappeared so completely they became urban legends. Did you hear about the Uran who ran off to become a nun? They say she lives in the hills now, reading fortunes and raising her child like a ghost. But running wasn't freedom. It was just a different kind of cage one, where you traded makeup and money for silence and survival. And yet for many, it was the only choice that still felt like a choice. Because when your entire world is painted in rules and red lipstick, the scariest thing isn't leaving. It's staying and pretending it didn't happen. So they ran, not for revenge, not for rebellion, just for the smallest, most dangerous luxury of all: hope. Let's say a courtesan couldn't run, couldn't drink enough tea, couldn't fake enough smiles. The courtesan had to remain calm, because if she made too much noise, she wasn't just risking scandal, she was risking exile or worse. What these women endured physically, emotionally, is almost unspeakable. But they did it because the alternative was worse. If a courtesan managed to give birth in secret, there was still one problem left, a tiny, crying, impossibly fragile problem. If she was lucky, a monk or kind stranger might find the child. Sometimes a temple took them in, raising them in silence. Some shrines were said to be haunted. Locals claimed they heard crying at night, not from the babies, but from the women who left them. In the eyes of Japanese tradition, an unborn or aborted child isn't just a medical footnote, it's a spirit. Some women were haunted not just emotionally, but spiritually. It was said Mizuko could cause misfortune, illness, or nightmares, if not properly honored. Courtesans couldn't raise their children, but they could ask the gods to protect them. Mizuko weren't just spirits. They were reminders that love existed, however briefly. They panned the icy rivers by night. They drank, gambled, fought, and made terrible decisions in candlelit saloons. Fortunes could be won with one lucky swing of a pick and lost in a single hand of poker. There were no rules, or rather, there were too many, made up on the spot and enforced by whoever had the biggest gun or loudest voice. Justice was improvised. Courtrooms were rare. Lynch mobs were not. But it wasn't just lawlessness, it was loneliness too. The population was overwhelmingly male. For every woman, there were dozens, sometimes hundreds of men. But many others didn't last. When the gold dried up, the people vanished. Some struck it rich in a day. Most didn't. They dug holes, moved boulders, built flumes, dammed creeks, and chased every rumor of easy gold like moths to flame. What was once a buzzing boom town became a ghost town, buildings left to rot, saloons still stocked with broken glasses, wind whispering through empty jail cells. People had found it, and if they could, maybe you could too. That was the sickness of it. Every backbreaking failure still carried the hope that the next shovel of dirt might change everything. So they dug day after day, year after year. Long before the miners came, the land was home to hundreds of thousands of Native Americans living across dozens of nations and tribes. So were thieves. Disease was constant dysentery, scurvy, cholera, because sanitation was non-existent. And miners weren't exactly washing their hands before meals. By 1870, California's native population had plummeted by over 80%. Mexican and Chilean miners who'd even work in California's hills long before 1849 were soon targeted by racist laws and mobs. Chinese immigrants, who arrived in waves hoping to earn a better life, were taxed heavily and driven out of claims by violence. Because once you saw gold, really saw it, your soul never quite looked the same again. Black miners, both free and enslaved, faced legal and physical threats every step of the way. And for every ounce pulled from the ground, something else was buried: deeper justice, peace, community, or conscience. What began as a rush for gold became a quiet genocide. It was a lawless, rapidly changing frontier where a man's wealth or the size of his revolver often decided right from wrong. If someone broke the rules, they were brought before a jury of their muddy, exhausted peers. But fairness was relative. Beans, bacon, and coffee made up the holy trinity of miner cuisine. They were courtrooms, gambling halls, and sometimes execution grounds. A drunken insult could escalate into a shootout. Property lines were often decided with fists, bullets, or hastily scribbled signs nailed to trees. A lost card game might end in murder. California drafted a constitution in 1849, even before it officially became a state in 1850. Gunsmoke and lawlessness danced side by side beneath swinging lanterns. Because in the gold fields, justice had always been improvised. And even when the rules arrived, they came too late for many buried beneath the hills, forgotten in dry creek beds, or swinging from tree branches. Suspects could be whipped, run out of town, or tied to a tree with a rope around their neck, often without evidence. "He found a nugget on my land" might get you hanged. Yes, hanged. Vegetables were rare, bathing optional. Haircuts? Forget it. Claims were stolen. Camps erupted in gunfire. Fortune created friction, and everyone believed they deserved the prize. Gold brought chaos. It twisted morals. It rewrote values. But success wasn't the only test. Tenacity was. As miners poured in, native lands were seized, poisoned, and burned. Rivers once full of salmon were clogged with debris and mercury. Forests were cut down. Wildlife vanished. And the people they were pushed out, hunted, enslaved, killed. And in the muddy chaos of the gold fields, that was sometimes the only thing separating the legends from the lost. The gold rush didn't just create towns, it devoured them. Letters from the East spoke of homesickness, heartbreak, and men crying quietly by campfires. The gold wasn't always in the ground. Sometimes it was just a memory of what they left behind. Some towns flourished for a time. San Francisco transformed from a sleepy harbor to a rowdy, bustling gateway to the gold fields. For all the stories of overnight fortunes, the truth was far grittier. Most miners didn't get rich. Some found just enough to survive. Many left poorer than they arrived, carrying nothing home but blisters and regret. If you had money, you might splurge on a rocker box, a wooden contraption that let you sift through more dirt at once. If you really had cash, a long Tom sluice. If not, it was all down to your two hands, gravity, and patience. For every success story, there were hundreds of shattered dreams buried beneath muddy floors and abandoned tools. But no one came west expecting guarantees. They came for a chance. The life of a prospector wasn't glamorous. It was hard, lonely, and often miserable. But still, they came, because the promise of riches, even the slimmest chance, made men do impossible things. And boomtowns, chaotic, filthy, and burning with hope, were where that chance lived for a little while. Gold fever sounds romantic until you're knee-deep in freezing river water, swinging a pickaxe into rock, sleeping on dirt, and calling beans your only friend. Most arrived with little more than hope, and a few essentials: a pickaxe, a shovel, a gold pan, maybe a tin plate or two. Panning for gold meant hours bent over a river, swirling sediment, hoping to catch a flicker of yellow among the rocks. They slept in tents if they were lucky, open skies if they weren't. Rain meant wet clothes, snow meant frozen boots. Bears were a risk, food was basic and expensive. Eggs could cost more than a day's wages, and still they stayed. Because the gold was real, some never found more than dust. Others found enough to change their lives, or at least buy one hot bath and a better pair of boots. Gold didn't just come out of the earth. It came with a price tag written in blood, sweat, and broken promises. But the cost wasn't just personal, it was national. California was never empty, though gold rush mythology would have you believe otherwise. But once gold was discovered, they were treated as little more than obstacles between ambition and profit. The California state government even funded militias to clear the land, paying bounties for native scalps. But native tribes weren't the only ones who paid. Even white miners fought among themselves. Men who once believed in family, law, and church found themselves bribing, lying, stealing, sometimes killing all for a glint in a pan. The gold rush wasn't just an event. It was a fever, a transformation. Gold may have glinted in the rivers, but justice, that was a little harder to find. In the early days of the California gold rush, there were no real laws. California wasn't even a state yet, so the miners made up their own rules. They formed what were called mining codes, loose agreements about claim sizes, boundaries, and behavior. He stole my shovel, might get you a warning. Vigilante justice became the norm. There weren't enough sheriffs, so towns formed vigilance committees, self-appointed enforcers, quick to punish and rarely interested in trials. And saloons, they weren't just places to drink. Theft was rampant. Claim jumping, when someone tried to take over another man's land, could spark all-out war between rival camps. But amidst the chaos, something strange happened. Communities began to emerge. Makeshift governments formed. Real sheriffs were elected. Towns started building courthouses instead of gallows. The Wild West began to tame itself, slowly, violently, unevenly. But the scars of that early lawlessness never quite healed. That once doubled as judges. The California Gold Rush wasn't just an American story. It was a worldwide alarm bell, and it rang loud. By 1850, ships from every continent were docking in San Francisco Bay, their sails heavy with wind, their decks heavy with dreamers. They came from Peru, Mexico, and the West Indies, bringing skills, spices, and music. From China, thousands crossed the Pacific in wooden boats, driven by famine, poverty, and the promise of Gold Mountain. Europe sent its share to Ireland, Germany, Italy, and France, many escaping revolution, poverty, or war. Even a handful of Australians showed up, having chased their own gold and figured they'd try again on another continent. And for better or worse, it showed what happened when cultures collided, not over ideals, but over gold. The easy gold, the glittering flakes and nuggets that could be scooped from shallow stream beds, was gone. What remained was deeper, harder to reach, and required tools that most miners couldn't afford. Gold fever had gone global, and California wasn't just a place, it was an idea. Cooking fires filling the hills with scents from 5 different continents. These industrial outfits used hydraulic mining massive jets of water, blasting entire hillsides apart to extract the precious metal. It was faster, more efficient, and devastating. Landscapes were shredded, rivers clogged with debris and mercury. Farmland downstream was ruined. Those who came expecting instant wealth now faced a cruel truth. The gold rush had never been a promise, only a gamble. Lawsuits would eventually bring hydraulic mining to a halt decades later, and for most, the house had won. At first, it seemed like something beautiful, a global gathering all drawn by the same dream. But dreams have borders. And when gold was scarce, prejudice grew fast. And while the miners moved on, California stayed gold not just in its hills, but in its legend. It had roads, ports, towns, newspapers, banks, and finally statehood. Even today, nearly 2 centuries later, California still wears the gold rush like a second skin. Its nickname, the Golden State, its motto, Eureka, I have found it. It's not subtle. Some returned home with empty pockets. Others drifted into new frontiers, Oregon, Nevada, Colorado, chasing the next rumor, the next miracle. They became shopkeepers, ranchers, teachers, mayors. They built California not with shovels, but with roots. It taught a young, hungry nation that fortune wasn't inherited. It could be chased, dug, fought for. That you didn't need a noble name, just a shovel and a little madness. Yes, it brought rapid growth, innovation, and the birth of the modern West. It gave rise to San Francisco, to the railroad, to California as a cultural and economic giant. Because while the gold was drying up, something else had taken hold possibility. They built communities, temples, churches, and businesses. It revealed the best and worst of human nature in the span of a single decade. San Francisco's Chinatown took root. Latino towns thrived along old Spanish land grants. But the dream it sparked still burns bright. And even as they were pushed to the margins, these global pioneers helped shape the future of California in its food, its language, its spirit. Her parents, Arthur and Kate Keller, were thrilled. She was healthy, beautiful, and curious, with bright blue eyes and a soft, eager laugh. She learned to crawl, to babble, to smile at her mother's face, and to chase shadows across the porch. All anyone could do was wait. She loved the family dog, the garden, the wind. Her body trembled. She was not yet 2 years old. Maybe she'd respond to a sound, a voice, a bell, a dog's bark. Her mother hovered, terrified, and then it broke. The fever passed. Helen survived, but the cost was staggering. Her world was full of sound and color until suddenly it wasn't. But their stories were buried under the glittering myth of the white prospector with the lucky pan. And no one knew how to reach her. Not yet. They came from Chile-seasoned miners who had worked South America's gold fields long before the discovery at Sutter's Mill. Their success was resented, their accents mocked. Laws like the foreign miners' tax were introduced, targeting non-American miners with steep fees and harassment. Chinese miners were especially vulnerable. They were driven from claims, beaten, sometimes killed while officials looked the other way. Spanish-speaking miners, even those born in California, faced legal discrimination and mob violence. Racism wasn't just casual, it was policy. It had shattered indigenous populations, transformed the economy, and turned a sleepy frontier into a symbol of American reinvention. California became a swirling, churning, multilingual chaos. Tents pitched side by side. Arguments shouted in a dozen dialects. Foreign miners were often viewed with suspicion or outright hostility. No way to express what she wanted or what she feared. Still, many stayed. The gold rush didn't just bring people west, it brought the world west. Gold has a way of running out, even when the fever doesn't. By the mid-1850s, the rivers were quieter. The rush was over. Some stayed, switching from panning to wage labor in large mining operations. The gold might have still been flowing, but it came at a terrible cost. Meanwhile, many of the original 49ers packed up and left broken by exhaustion, illness, or simple disappointment. And a few stayed. California had transformed. It was no longer a forgotten territory. In 1850, just 2 years after Marshall's discovery, California officially joined the Union. The gold rush was over, but its impact was irreversible. It had redrawn the map. It had filled the West with people, ambition, and violence. What began with a sparkle in a river ended with an empire in motion. Because sometimes the greatest treasure isn't what you dig up, it's what you build after the digging ends. The gold rush ended, but its echo never stopped. This wasn't just a historical event. It became a national identity, a cultural myth baked into America's DNA. Because the gold rush wasn't just about gold. It was about reinvention. It was the beginning of the American dream. As we now know it, move fast, take risks, state your claim. But the legacy is complicated, but it also left scars, deep ones. Native communities were nearly erased. Landscapes were ravaged. Racist laws created lasting wounds. Chinese laborers, Mexican miners, black pioneers, they built California too. And yet, people still come. Not for gold, perhaps, but for something like it, for tech, for fame, for reinvention. Silicon Valley isn't far from Sutter's Mill. The tools have changed from pickaxes to code, but the hunger, it's the same. That's the real legacy, the belief that somewhere, just over the horizon, with enough guts and luck, everything can change. The gold rush wasn't just a rush for metal. It was a collision of cultures, of ambitions, of illusions. And it turned one accidental discovery into one of the most transformational chapters in American history. The gold is mostly gone now. Helen Adams Keller was born on June 27, 1880, in Tuscumbia, Alabama, place of green fields, cotton farms, and southern sun. For the first 19 months of her life, Helen was just like any other child. In February 1882, Helen was struck by a mysterious illness. Some said scarlet fever. Others believed it was meningitis. Doctors didn't know. For days she burned with fever. She could no longer see, no longer hear. The world had turned dark and silent, as if the illness had slammed a door, shut sealing her inside her own body. At first, her family hoped it was temporary. Maybe she was just recovering slowly. Maybe her eyes would adjust. But time passed, and it became clear Helen had been cut off from the senses that connect us to the world. Now imagine this. A toddler, filled with energy and intelligence, suddenly unable to understand the faces smiling at her, the arms reaching for her, the voices calling her name. She had no language, no symbols. Frustration filled the silence. Rage followed. She learned to mimic actions, to open doors, to nod or shake her head, but not meaning. Her world was texture, vibration, smell. And inside her, a storm brewed. By the age of 5, Helen Keller was described as a wild child, intelligent, strong-willed, and completely unmanageable. She would scream, kick, and even hit those around her, not out of cruelty, but desperation. She was locked inside her own mind. By the time Helen Keller was 5 years old, the cheerful toddler who once played in the garden had become something else, entirely untamed. Imagine being locked in total darkness. No sound, no sight, no language, just raw sensation and confusion. For Helen, life had become a blur of textures and instincts. She had no words to express hunger or fear, no way to understand comfort or discipline. Helen Keller wasn't cruel, she was trapped. The world had shut its doors, and she was pounding on them with everything she had. A young woman named Anne Sullivan arrived, determined to teach the unteachable. She moved into a small cottage on the Keller property, taking Helen away from the main house, away from indulgence, distraction, and pity. Anne's method was radical: structure, discipline, and above all, language. She spelled the names of everything Helen touched: cake, mug, spoon, water, bread, key. But the child didn't connect them. There was no concept yet, no understanding that the shapes in her palm represented the world around her. She dropped the mug. She touched the ground, Anne spelled earth. She touched the pump, Anne spelled pump. She touched Anne's dress, her face, her own hand. She had gotten it. Anne Sullivan had one job: open the door. And nothing, not rage, not silence, not blindness, was going to stop her from trying. So she lashed out. She threw tantrums, kicked furniture, ripped buttons off clothes, and slapped her baby sister out of jealousy. The moment the silence broke, and the world, for the first time, had meaning. The door had opened, and now she wanted to run through it. They walked through gardens, touched flowers, leaves, bark, soil. She asked deep philosophical questions. What is love? Where does the sun go at night? Why do people cry? Helen learned the word flower by feeling a rose, tree by hugging its trunk, storm by standing in the rain. Her mind, starved for years, devoured everything Anne offered: nouns, verbs, adjectives. She wanted to name the entire world, every object, every sensation, every emotion. Nothing was too small, too abstract, too complex. Each word she spelled made her feel more human, more seen. She wasn't just a teacher. She was translator, mentor, protector, best friend. The bond between them was deeper than family, closer than blood. The frustration that had once driven her to scream and break things had transformed into purpose. Anne spelled stories into her hand: biblical parables, Aesop's fables, poems, fairy tales. Through these, Helen learned about kindness, selfishness, generosity, justice. D-O-L-She would sign into Helen's palm as she handed her a doll. She could read Braille, write full sentences, and communicate rapidly through finger spelling. She devoured books, memorized poems, and debated complex ideas with her teacher, Anne. Helen copied the movements. She was smart, curious, but to her it was just finger play motions with no meaning. She could mimic 100 signs and still not grasp that things had names. In one hand, she placed Helen's fingers under the flow of cool water. There she met Sarah Fuller, a dedicated speech teacher who agreed to try the impossible. With the other, she spelled into her palm W, again and again, water splashing, fingers moving. U-D-R. Helen placed her fingers on Sarah's lips, cheeks, and throat as she spoke. She felt the vibration of sounds, the shape of the mouth, the movement of the tongue. Then, slowly, painfully, she began to mimic them letter by letter, word by word. Her meals became battlegrounds. She ate with her hands, grabbed food from others' plates, and screamed when anyone tried to correct her. Her moods could swing from laughter to rage without warning. The Kellers didn't know what to do. Their daughter was intelligent. That much was obvious. A door had opened, and Helen, once locked in silent darkness, had found her way through. She had figured out routines, learned how to open doors, unlock cabinets, even mimic household tasks. But her intelligence made her defiance more dangerous. Her parents were exhausted. Relatives whispered that she belonged in an asylum. Her mother, Kate, refused to give up. She began writing letters, searching for help, not just from doctors, but from anyone who might know how to reach a child like Helen. The trail led them to Alexander Graham Bell, who, aside from inventing the telephone, was deeply involved in education for the deaf. Bell didn't have the solution, but he had a suggestion. He pointed them toward a school in Boston, the Perkins Institute for the Blind. And at that school, a young woman was recommended to travel south and meet the Kellers. Her name was Anne Sullivan. She was just 20 years old, visually impaired herself, poor, fiercely determined, and completely unprepared for the storm she was about to walk into. When Anne arrived in Alabama in March 1887, she was greeted by a bright, beautiful child. Uncombed hair, wild eyes, a mischievous grin, and a scream that could shatter windows. March 1887, Tuscumbia, Alabama. But how do you teach language to a child who doesn't hear words or see letters? Anne began by spelling them into Helen's hand, one letter at a time, using the manual alphabet used by the deaf. Anne was relentless. Then came April 5, 1887, a day etched into history. Anne took Helen to the water pump outside. Suddenly, Helen froze. The chaos inside her calmed. Her face lit up with wonder. For the first time in her life, Helen Keller understood that everything had a name, and that words could be touched, felt, learned. That single moment shattered the walls that had imprisoned her since infancy. By nightfall, she had learned 30 words. She would go on to learn thousands. But that was the moment. Once Helen understood that words had meaning, there was no going back. Anne could barely keep up. She taught Helen using real-world experience. And she didn't just want to know what things were. She wanted to know why they were. This wasn't memorization. It was awakening. She also began to understand manners and morality, not just yes and no, but right and wrong. Language wasn't just power, it was freedom. Helen even began writing her first simple sentences using a special slate with raised lines. But none of this happened by accident. Anne Sullivan worked tirelessly, often 16 hours a day, to unlock Helen's potential. Anne had once called herself half-blind and unwanted. Now she was shaping one of the most remarkable minds in history. And the world began to notice. Newspapers started publishing stories about the miracle child in Alabama, the deaf-blind girl who was now reading, writing, learning faster than anyone believed possible. Helen's hunger wasn't slowing down. If anything, she was just getting started. Because now that she had a voice, even if it came through fingers, she wanted to speak to everyone. And one day soon, she would. By the age of 10, Helen Keller had already defied expectations. But it wasn't enough. Helen didn't just want to communicate, she wanted to speak. The idea seemed absurd. She was both deaf and blind. How could she possibly learn to form words she had never heard, shaped by sounds she had never experienced? But Helen wasn't asking for permission. She was asking for instruction. So, in 1890, her family sent her to the Horace Mann School for the Deaf in Boston. The method was tactile. She practiced endlessly forming syllables in front of mirrors, feeling her own face, repeating each sound dozens of times. Her first word was it. Next came is, I, have. Small steps, giant courage. It wasn't easy. Her voice was difficult to understand at first. Even those closest to her struggled to make out her words. But Helen kept going because to her, speech was freedom on another level, a bridge to the world she had never truly entered. And every day, her pronunciation improved. Anne was by her side through every attempt, encouraging, correcting, celebrating. Together, they turned what seemed like a miracle into a method. By 12, Helen could speak full sentences. With time, she would learn to give speeches, recite poetry, even engage in lively conversation, though most people still needed an interpreter to understand her clearly. Photographers tried to capture her studying, reading, writing, but Helen pressed on, proving her intellect over and over. People wanted to see the blind girl with a mind, but Helen didn't want to be a spectacle. She wanted to learn not as a novelty, but as an equal. But that didn't matter, because Helen Keller had done what even optimists thought impossible. She gave sound to silence. She had no memory of hearing her own voice, and yet she had created one with breath, muscle, and pure defiance. Helen took on poverty, women's suffrage, racism, child labor, and workers' rights. She criticized powerful corporations, supported birth control, and even spoke out against war. She had taken on academia without sight or sound and won. But it wasn't just a personal triumph. This shocked many of her admirers, people who were comfortable applauding her triumph over disability, but weren't ready for her to challenge their bank accounts. It is true that I am blind and deaf, but I am not blind to social injustice, nor deaf to the cries of the suffering. It was a public declaration that disability did not mean inability, that the human spirit, given a chance, could outshine every limitation. She testified before Congress, lobbied for Braille books in libraries, and championed equal education for the disabled. She met world leaders, presidents, authors, and revolutionaries. She was blunt, brilliant, and impossible to dismiss. And though many disagreed with her politics, no one could ignore her presence. She had found her voice, and she would spend the rest of her life using it. But who saw more clearly than most, and who spoke more powerfully than those with perfect voices? By her mid-teens, Helen Keller had already achieved more than most people expected in a lifetime. But she wasn't content with being a miracle. She wanted to be educated truly, formally, completely. Crowds gathered just to see her walk onto a stage. Heads of state bent to shake her hand. Children reached for her, eyes wide, as if touching her might pass on some of her fire. With her education complete, Helen stepped into a new role, not as a student, but as a fighter. She had known darkness. Together they continued the mission: public speaking, fundraising, lobbying, writing. She had known silence. But this, the silence left by Anne's absence, was different. Universities gave her honorary degrees. Foundations were named in her honor. Books and films told her story. Her presence gave them more than comfort. It gave them a glimpse of what survival looked like when everything else had failed. It was deeper. A voice for the unheard. A symbol for those the world ignored. She had become a global icon, a symbol of courage, intellect, and boundless will. From Tokyo to Cairo, from Washington to Moscow, her name meant something powerful: hope. She enrolled at the Cambridge School for Young Ladies, a prep school for women aspiring to attend Radcliffe College, the sister school to Harvard. For decades, they had been inseparable two souls, fused by struggle and love. But in 1936, Anne passed away. It was grueling. Anne Sullivan attended every class, spelling entire lectures into Helen's hand, letter by letter, hour after hour. Imagine taking notes when you can't see the blackboard, can't hear the professor, and must absorb every word through touch. And darkness, now mourned across the world by presidents, poets, activists, and everyday people who had never even met her. So she set her sights on something no deafblind person had ever attempted: college. Helen studied Latin, French, algebra, geometry, philosophy, history, literature. Her days were long, her nights even longer. She often went to bed with sore hands and a spinning mind. There were moments of pure frustration, tears, exhaustion, even doubt. But she never gave up. The decision stunned people. Some admired it, others mocked it. But Helen didn't care. Every textbook had to be transcribed into Braille. Every test dictated word by painstaking word. She was accepted into Radcliffe College in 1900. Suddenly, she wasn't just a student. She was a symbol. Newspapers followed her story. At Radcliffe, she continued her intense studies, even as administrators remained skeptical. Some professors doubted her intelligence. Others found Anne Sullivan's constant presence distracting. In 1904, at age 24, Helen Keller graduated cum laude from Radcliffe College, the first deafblind person in the world to earn a college degree. And Helen was just getting started. Now educated, articulate, and ready to change the world, she turned toward a new battlefield: activism. Helen Keller could not hear a crowd cheer or see her name in print, but she could feel injustice, and she refused to be silent about it. She became a fierce advocate for the blind and the deaf, but she didn't stop there. People expected a quiet, delicate woman. What they got was a political firestorm. She joined the Socialist Party in 1909, arguing that capitalism was crushing the poor while the rich prospered. When someone accused her of being misled, she replied, she gave lectures around the country, sometimes with Anne Sullivan beside her interpreting her words. She campaigned for the American Foundation for the Blind, helping to raise awareness and funding across the nation. She wrote books, essays, columns, letters. Her pen was a sword, and she wielded it without fear. In the public eye, she was a paradox, a woman who couldn't see or hear. She demanded dignity, not just for herself, but for the marginalized, the voiceless, the forgotten. Helen Keller had once lived in a world without words. Now her words were changing the world. As Helen Keller grew older, the world grew louder in its admiration. She traveled the world over 35 countries advocating for the blind and the disabled. And yet behind the applause, there was always shadow. Anne Sullivan, her companion, teacher, and best friend, began to lose her health in the 1920s. Helen was devastated, and still she continued. She found support in Polly Thompson, who became her new interpreter and companion. Helen didn't slow down, not even in her 70s. In 1948, she toured Japan after World War II, meeting wounded soldiers, children in ruined schools, and people who had lost everything. She received dozens of honors, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of America's highest civilian awards. But Helen didn't care for trophies. She cared that blind children had books, that deaf adults had jobs, that people who once felt invisible now felt seen. Even as her own health declined in her final years, she continued to write letters, dictate messages, and support causes she believed in. She once said, "Although the world is full of suffering, it is also full of the overcoming of it." She had lived both sides of that sentence, and through it all, she remained fully, fiercely herself. On June 1st, 1968, at the age of 87, Helen Keller passed away in her sleep. She died peacefully in her home in Connecticut, a woman, once locked in silence, but death could not silence her. Helen had become more than a person. She had become a force, a symbol of what the human spirit could do when handed the worst and still daring to rise. Born into a world that offered her nothing, no sight, no sound, no voice, she created a life that left nothing untouched. She helped rewrite how people viewed disability. She shattered the idea that blindness meant helplessness or that deafness meant ignorance. She proved that communication isn't limited to ears or eyes. It comes from the soul. She wrote 14 books, gave hundreds of speeches, and met every U.S. president from Grover Cleveland to Lyndon B. Johnson. She changed laws. She changed institutions. But most of all, she changed minds. Her life wasn't easy, and she never pretended otherwise. She faced illness, rejection, grief, and public criticism. But she never let those things define her. Instead, she defined herself loudly. She once said, "I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something." And what she did was reshape history. Today, schools bear her name. Statues stand in her honor. Her books are still read. In ancient Egypt, fashion wasn't just practical. It was sacred. With the Nile as their mirror and the desert as their backdrop, Egyptians draped themselves in linen light, breathable, and born from the flax that grew along the riverbanks. But it wasn't just about beating the heat. Clothes were spiritual, symbolic. Pharaohs wore finely pleated kilts, golden pectorals, and intricate collars encrusted with lapis lazuli, carnelian, and turquoise. Legend says Empress Lisu discovered it when a silkworm cocoon dropped into her tea. And long before anyone said, "Look at me," clothes already had the world's attention. The ancient Greeks favored balance in all things, in architecture, in thought, and in the folds of their garments. Men wore chitons, rectangular linen garments pinned at the shoulder and belted at the waist. Women draped themselves in peploi or hamasha cloaks with graceful folds that transformed the body into a living sculpture. And magistrates, and the toga pecta embroidered with gold and reserved for emperors and victorious generals. Each type was a costume of authority. Sandals were simple. Hair was styled with restraint. Jewelry, though present, was always in service to harmony. The palla, a cloak-like shawl, offered modesty and movement. Hair was curled, braided, piled high, and sometimes adorned with gold or ivory pins. Fashion wasn't just about beauty. It was a message of fertility, virtue, and social belonging. For centuries, the knowledge of silk production was guarded like a state secret. Only royalty and high-ranking officials were allowed to wear the most refined silks dyed in colors reserved for emperors, like the brilliant, near-mythical imperial yellow. Even slaves had a fashion role defined by what they couldn't wear. To the Greeks, beauty was moral. Simplicity meant virtue. Ornamentation was fine as long as it didn't shout. Every fold, every fabric, every color was a declaration. Its fabric, weave, and design communicated season, occasion, and even political loyalty. The samurai's kimono was sometimes worn beneath armor, its crest boldly announcing clan allegiance. For geisha and courtiers, kimono sleeves became canvases for art. You didn't just wear a toga, you wore the state. And as fabrics flowed along the Silk Road, Asia quietly taught the world something vital, that clothing wasn't just about protection or pride. From castle halls to candlelit courts, fashion became a chessboard where every thread was a move and every outfit a declaration of power, virtue, or rebellion. The poor wore coarse wool and undyed linen. The rich turned themselves into walking tapestries. And then came sumptuary law's literal legal codes that dictated what you could or could not wear based on your social rank. If you dared to wear silk without noble blood, that wasn't a fashion crime. It was an actual crime. Fur-lined cloaks, jewel-studded belts, and elaborate braids signaled wealth and piety in equal measure. Florence and Venice led the way, creating garments so opulent they seemed to defy gravity. Men wore puffed sleeves and slashed doublets. Women donned velvet gowns with rigid bodices and embroidered sleeves that whispered stories of family lineage. It was culture sewn into skin. By the time of the Shang dynasty, silk became a state secret, protected as fiercely as gold. The Silk Road was more than a trade route. It was a fashion superhighway stretching from China to the Mediterranean. It carried not just goods, but ideas, fabrics, and styles that would shape centuries of dress. Who wore silk? The elite, the rulers, the heavens' favorites. Even this early, fashion was never random. The sari, still worn today, dates back thousands of years. Woven from fine cotton and silk, dyed with indigo and turmeric. Saris weren't just beautiful, they were regional fingerprints. A woman's folded fabric and border could reveal where she was from, her caste, her status. It separated kings from servants, priests from commoners, men from women, and sometimes mortals from gods. Embroidered dragons, phoenixes, and clouds weren't just decoration. They were spiritual markers of rank and destiny. A person's robe said more than a scroll ever could. During the Han period, nobles wore layered silk robes called juni hito, their sleeves and collars revealing carefully coordinated colors, a kind of poetic fashion code. But as the samurai class rose, fashion turned toward function and symbolism. Where the Greeks draped, the Romans layered and legislated. The toga, made from a single piece of wool up to 20 feet long, became the ultimate Roman status symbol. A wealthy Romang might wear a tunic woven from Egyptian linen or dyed with rare murex purple, a color so expensive it was worth more than gold. Not everyone could wear one. Only male Roman citizens, and even then, there were rules. Every color meant something. White for purity, green for fertility, blue for the gods. The more detailed the weave, the more divine your status. Her quotes are still passed between people in need of strength, and in moments when life feels too heavy, when silence seems too loud, when darkness seems to stretch endlessly. Her legacy reminds us there is always a way through. The earliest legal code to mention clothing, the Code of Hammurabi, actually dictated who could wear what. Veils were reserved for noble women. Slaves were forbidden to wear them. You may not see it, you may not hear it, but you can be it. People wore saris, dhotis, and turbans dyed with plant-based pigments like indigo and madder root. Their textiles told stories of region, ritual, and rhythm. The Indus Valley might not have left us volumes of written history, but its tiny terracotta figurines show hairstyles, jewelry, and textiles that speak across time. Helen Keller never saw sunrise. She never heard applause. But she taught the world how to listen, and that's a voice that never fades. Long before runways and designer tags, fashion began where civilization did, with sunlight, sand, and the struggle to survive. Even children went unclothed until puberty, their innocence worn openly, while the elite were wrapped like living statues, their garments reflecting order and cosmic balance. Across the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia, fashion served a similar dual purpose, protection and prestige. Men wore woolen skirts tied with belts. Women wore layered robes and veils. Ancient India brought color into the conversation with hand-spun cotton and early silk. Then there was China, where silk wasn't just a fabric, it was a revolution. The shape of a robe, the twist of a belt, the color of a thread fashion was language before writing, art before galleries. In the marble halls of Athens and on the crowded streets of Rome, fashion became philosophy and a uniform of identity. But then came Rome, and Rome never whispered. Roman fashion was about spectacle, power, class. There was the toga virilis for adult men, the toga praetexta with a purple stripe for senators. Beneath the togas, everyone wore tunics, the t-shirt of the ancient world simple, knee-length for men, ankle-length for women. But even tunics told stories. Women's fashion in Rome was equally coded. The stola marked a married woman. In both Greece and Rome, clothing didn't just protect the body. It displayed your rank, your role, your citizenship. While Rome wrapped itself in wool and Greece in linen, Asia was spinning something far more luxurious: silk. At the heart of it all was China, where silk wasn't just an export, it was a symbol of imperial control. Chinese robes, especially under the Tang and Han dynasties, were masterpieces of structure and symbolism. Further west in India, fashion took a different turn: bold, colorful, and sensually draped. Meanwhile, in Japan, elegance met armor. Enter the kimono. Worn by both warriors and commoners, the kimono became a garment of layered meaning. Asian fashion balanced tradition with refinement, restraint with richness. Every pleat, pattern, and stitch was deliberate. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, Clothing was not just what you wore, it was who you were. During the Middle Ages, clothing was rigidly tied to class. Dyes were everything. A deep blue meant wealth. A true scarlet was reserved for royalty and cardinals. In Renaissance Italy, fashion became an art form and political power. It was no coincidence that during this time of intellectual rebirth, fashion became intensely theatrical. The more fabric you wore, the less you were expected to work. In a world of crowns and conspiracies, clothing was armor not just against the cold, but against irrelevance. It was a silent performance of status. Look, how much I can afford to waste. Then came the corset. To the nobility, clothing was a way to rise above the ordinary. But everything it represented, excess, inequality, silk and satin at the expense of bread. Wigs and heavy makeup vanished almost overnight. The guillotine didn't just fall on kings. It fell on wigs, heels, and corsets. His wife, Josephine, popularized high-waisted gowns and sheer fabrics that redefined elegance for the Empire era. But the powdered wig had become a relic. Fashion had shifted from flaunting wealth to redefining identity. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how people worked, it changed how people dressed. The ideal woman became a fragile hourglass, floating on a sea of silk, lace, and tulle. Fashion was both a prison and a pedestal. Suddenly, clothing wasn't reserved for aristocrats and royalty. It was during this time that the modern suit began to take form. Clean, restrained, professional, dignified, without being flashy. Fashion magazines like Godey's Lady's Book and La Belle Assembly began shaping tastes. And with photography emerging, people could now see what fashion looked like far beyond their village. Machines could spin, dye, and stitch fabric faster than human hands ever could. Mass production meant lower prices, more availability, and for the first time in history, fashion began to trickle down. Home sewing patterns became popular. Style became accessible. Fashion was no longer just for the elite. It was becoming a tool for expression. The corset, once a daily ritual, became impractical, even dangerous. Skirts shortened, fabrics lightened. Practicality became patriotic. The fashion of the upper class became the uniform of the enemy. Women's fashion took on volume dramatic, sweeping, and almost absurd. The invention of the crinoline, a cage-like steel frame worn beneath skirts, allowed women to wear dresses that ballooned outward like open umbrellas. Hollywood glamorized this image on screen and off. Stars like Greta Garbo and Clark Gable set trends that audiences across the world followed. Some reached 6 feet in diameter, forcing women to move sideways through doors and practically orbit in ballroom circles. Materials were rationed. Skirts became shorter, jackets boxier, fabrics stiffer. Style didn't disappear. It adapted. Old garments were reworked. Flour sacks turned into dresses. Movie stars became style icons of hope amid economic despair. The message was clear. If you could wear a dress that prevented work, walking, or even sitting comfortably, you were probably wealthy enough not to care. She wore drop-waist dresses, bobbed her hair, painted her lips red, and danced in speakeasies with a cigarette holder in one hand and rebellion in the other. Nylon, once used for stockings, was redirected for parachutes. Her dresses shimmered with fringe and beads. Her knees scandalized society, and her confidence defied generations of restraint. Suddenly, simplicity was power. The sans culottes without breeches proudly rejected aristocratic knee-length trousers. Fashion designers like Elsa Schiaparelli introduced surreal elements, thumbing their noses at austerity. Instead, they wore plain trousers, the clothing of the working class. He called it the new look: cinched waists, full sweeping skirts, soft shoulders, and delicate fabrics. It was a dramatic return to opulence, a celebration of femininity, luxury, and control. To wear extravagant clothes during this time wasn't just tone deaf, it was dangerous. It became resilience, a signal to the world that even in chaos, we still choose who we are and what we wear to survive. To everyone else, it was a reminder of just how far they had fallen. At the French court of Louis XIV, fashion wasn't just a pastime, it was policy. Versailles was a stage, and everyone wore a costume. Men strutted in brocade coats with gold embroidery, lace cuffs, silk stockings, and red-heeled shoes, a signature of the king himself. Their hair powdered, perfumed, and piled into towering wigs, often adorned with curls, ribbons, and even miniature ships. Women's dresses were architectural wonders. Wide panniers stretched skirts out several feet on each side. Gowns were layered, ruffled, and embroidered within an inch of collapse. Skin was powdered white, cheeks painted red, and beauty spots placed like exclamation points. It was beautiful, ridiculous, and deeply political. Originally worn for posture and modesty, it evolved into a tool of silhouette control, cinching waists, lifting busts, and eventually becoming a symbol of both feminine elegance and restraint. The ideal woman's body became an architectural achievement, and in the grand courts of France and England, fashion reached dizzying new heights, literally, with towering wigs, ruffled collars, and dresses that required scaffolding underneath. Women moved like chandeliers, and men were just as dramatic, with tights, jewels, codpieces, and shoes that curled like punctuation marks. Fashion was power. A courtier's gown could curry favor or ruin reputations. To be seen was everything. To be seen incorrectly was dangerous. By the 17th century, European fashion had become a spectacle of excess. In a world where wealth meant control, fashion became a language of elite detachment. And then came the French Revolution. In 1789, the people stormed Versailles, not just the palace. In the wake of revolution, fashion itself became democratic. A classical world was idolized. Clean lines, natural fabrics, Greek-inspired gowns. Even Napoleon understood clothing as strategy. His military uniform, designed for drama and authority, helped create the image of the strong, modern leader. The revolution didn't just change who ruled France. It changed what people wore to survive it. The 19th century roared in on the hiss of steam engines and the hum of textile looms. But even as manufacturing modernized, style remained rooted in spectacle. Meanwhile, corsets tightened even further, shaping waists into wasp-like proportions. For men, fashion settled into sharp, sober lines, tailcoats, waistcoats, top hats, the uniform of the respectable gentleman. But beneath the surface, new trends were stirring. Department stores sprang up in cities, offering ready-made clothes to a growing middle class. The rise of the sewing machine in the 1850s brought yet another shift, not just in production, but in personal creativity. Even Queen Victoria had an impact, popularizing white wedding dresses, morning black, and modesty as fashion. In this new industrial world, clothes no longer just reflected identity. They were now building it one stitch at a time. As the 20th century dawned, fashion stood at a crossroads, torn between the corseted elegance of the past and the liberation roaring in with the future. Then came World War I, and everything changed. With men off to battle, women stepped into factories, fields, and offices. Women in uniforms, trousers, and simple tailored coats began to rewrite the definition of femininity. After the war, they weren't ready to go back. The 1920s ushered in a new archetype, the flapper. This was fashion as freedom as refusal. Meanwhile, the men of the Jazz Age embraced sharp suits, wide-legged trousers, slicked-back hair, and Oxford shoes. Then came the crash. The Great Depression of the 1930s forced fashion back toward conservatism. Hemlines dropped, colors dulled. People mended instead of buying. When World War II struck, fashion became a battlefield of its own. In the U.S., The government issued L-85 regulations dictating how much cloth could be used in civilian clothing. Women in Europe wore utility clothing efficient, minimalist, and often uniform-like. Men returned to service dress and battle dress. Yet out of these limits came innovation. Women wore slacks more frequently. Shoulder pads added structure. In the face of global conflict, fashion became more than style. The world emerged from World War II, battered but hungry for beauty. And in 1947, French designer Christian Dior gave it just that. For many women, it felt like breathing again after years of rations and uniforms. But not everyone applauded. To some, the new look was a step backward, a return to restrictive ideals after decades of progress. The tension between tradition and transformation would define fashion for decades to come. In the 1950s, American suburbia embraced clean-cut style pearls and pencil skirts, gray flannel suits, and everything ironed to perfection. But underneath the polished surface, rebellion was brewing. Teenagers, a newly defined demographic, began rejecting their parents' look. They idolized screen rebels like James Dean and Marlon Brando, whose plain white t-shirts, leather jackets, and blue jeans felt raw, honest, and dangerous. And there it was denim. Once a symbol of the American working class, denim became the uniform of youth rebellion. It wasn't fashion made for you. It was fashion you claimed. Then came the 1960s, and the revolution wasn't just televised, it was worn. The hippies embraced embroidery, bell-bottoms, and second-hand chic. London's mod culture gave birth to slim suits, miniskirts, and bold prints. Fashion became political anti-war, anti-establishment, anti-everything that came before. Haute couture still thrived, but streetwear had found its voice. By the 1970s, the lines had blurred. Music drove fashion from disco sequins to punk's torn shirts and safety pins. And through it all, jeans endured dressed up, distressed, or ripped in protest. Designers like Yves Saint Laurent, Vivienne Westwood, and others understood the shifting tide. Fashion was no longer dictated from the top down. It was now a two-way mirror reflecting and shaping the world all at once. Clothes were no longer just about class or gender. They were about attitude, identity, resistance. It stopped asking, "What should we wear?" and started asking, "Who are we?" From Dior's silks to Levi's denim, fashion had become something new entirely, not just what you wore, but who you were. As the 20th century ended, fashion shed its final skin. A teenager with a smartphone could spark a movement faster than a runway ever could. Brands like Zara, H&M, and Forever 21 churned out catwalk-inspired clothes at lightning speed. The 21st century began with a new energy one, driven by identity, diversity, and the rise of the digital age. Fashion was no longer ruled by seasonal trends whispered in the halls of Paris and Milan. Now it pulsed through Instagram, TikTok, and street corners in Seoul, Nairobi, and New York. Trends were global and instant. Upcycling became cool. Capsule wardrobes and buy less, choose well became mantras. The rise of fast fashion made style more accessible than ever before. But it came with a cost environmental damage, exploitative labor, and a growing awareness of fashion's dark side. In response, sustainability became a new standard. Designers started rethinking materials, waste, and responsibility. Thrift stores surged. But the real revolution? It was representation. For decades, fashion favored one body type, one skin tone, one ideal. But now the industry is changing. Designers are casting models of all races, sizes, genders, and abilities. Runways feature hijabs, wheelchairs, vitiligo, and drag. What once existed on the margins now walks center stage. Fashion became a battleground for cultural conversations. Think Black Lives Matter slogans on couture gowns, pride parades with high heels and glitter as protest armor. Indigenous designers reclaiming traditional patterns as a statement of survival. Gender no longer a cage, from androgynous tailoring to skirts on the men's racks. The binary boundaries of fashion began to blur. Icons like Billy Porter, Harry Styles, and Zendaya wore clothes not as statements, but as freedom. And in the metaverse, avatars strut in outfits that can't even exist in real life. Digital fashion, no fabric, no waste, just pixels and imagination, is becoming its own frontier. Fashion now lives everywhere, and it belongs to everyone. What began as linen in ancient Egypt has become a global language, one that can whisper tradition, scream rebellion, or simply say, "This is me." Because in the end, fashion isn't just what we wear. It's how we show the world who we are.